for the benefit of a wider audience. My name is Hamid Ghany. I am an honorary professor at SALISES based at St. Augustine, and I was the guest editor of this special edition of Social and Economic Studies, Volume 72, numbers 1 and 2, 2023, that was published on 31st July, 2024. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this session here today. I want to introduce the panelists who are contributors to this special edition on Republicanism, and they are Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, Professor of Constitutional Governance and Politics, Department of Government Sociology, Social Work and Psychology, the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. Dr. Pearson A. Broome, Lecturer in Political Science, Department of Government Sociology, Social Work and Psychology, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. Dr. Henderson Carter, Senior Lecturer in History, Department of History and Philosophy, the UWI, Cave Hill, Barbados. Dr. Derek O'Brien, Reader in Public Law at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Alison Ramsey, Lecturer in Cultural Heritage Studies, Department of History, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. And Mr. Rico Yearwood, Adjunct Lecturer in Law, Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. I am Hamid Ghany. As I told you, I'm Professor of Constitutional Affairs and Parliamentary Studies and an Honorary Professor at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies based here at SALISES in St. Augustine. The journal is available online from the website www.mona.uwi.edu/SES. And you can access the journal to see the articles that have been prepared by my colleagues. In my introductory remarks, I want to begin by saying that the issue of republicanism has regained traction in the Commonwealth Caribbean after a hiatus of some 43 years between the termination of the Associated Statehood of Dominica in November 1978 and the termination of the monarchical status of Barbados in November 2021. This special issue of Social and Economic Studies is dedicated to the topic of republicanism in the Commonwealth Caribbean. Guyana in 1970 and Trinidad and Tobago in 1976 started the trend shortly after attaining their independence in 1966 and in 1962, respectively. It seemed as though the momentum for republicanism was present in the 1970s, as three countries removed the authority of Queen Elizabeth II in her personal capacity as Queen of Guyana, Queen of Trinidad and Tobago, and Queen of Dominica in less than a decade, 1970, 1976, and 1978. Another opportunity presented itself in 1979 with the Grenada Revolution led by Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement that overthrew the government of Prime Minister Sir Eric Gairy in 1979, and that surprisingly opted to keep Grenada as a monarchy by continuing to recognize Queen Elizabeth II as head of state and Governor General, Sir Paul Scone as Her Majesty's representative. Bishop and his colleagues stunted the momentum towards republicanism with their tactical blunder. 4 years later, when their People's Revolutionary Government collapsed because of internal feuding and internecine warfare, it was Governor General Sir Paul Scone who became the chief constitutional figure in the restoration of civilian government out of the ashes of the collapse of the PRG, as he was able to use the reserve powers of the Crown to undertake a host of actions in the name of Her Majesty. Grenada could have been the next Commonwealth Caribbean Republic in the decade of the 1970s, but it was a road that was not traveled by the PRG. In 1979, both St. Lucia in February and St. Vincent and the Grenadines in October became independent monarchies, thereby resuming a trend that started with the independence movement of the 1960s, when Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became independent in 1962, followed by Barbados and Guyana in 1966. The Bahamas also became an independent monarchy in 1973 and not a republic. The Republican movement of the 1970s stalled for 4 decades before Barbados picked up the mantle of republicanism in 2021. The road to republicanism was not a straightforward one in Barbados, as the Tom Adams administration had appointed a Constitution Commission in 1978 to examine constitutional reform. Alison Ramsey tells us that in 1979, the Cox Commission recommended the retention of the monarchical system for Barbados. Cynthia Barrow-Giles and Rico Yearwood provide us with an interesting overview of the trials and tribulations of the shift from monarchism to republicanism in the Commonwealth Caribbean. The collection of articles in this special issue has highlighted some key areas of the Republican movement in the Commonwealth Caribbean that have been relatively muted. Derek O'Brien provides a useful analysis of the road to republicanism in the Commonwealth Caribbean that straddles the range from quasi-ceremonial presidencies to hybrid presidential parliamentary republicanism. Alison Ramsey provides an insight into the movement to republicanism in Barbados, as does Henderson Carter. They come at the subject from different perspectives, with Carter using a broad sweep of historical events from the era of emancipation and an analysis of Britain's imperial project to trace the evolution to republicanism in Barbados that located in a particular historical context, and Ramsey examining key historical milestones along the way and analyzing Barbadian republicanism in contemporary events that are quite illuminating. Pearson Broome provides a look into what 21st century constitutional reform should look like in an era of digitization. He makes the connection between constitutional business as usual and the demands of technology and the creation of a new body of rights that now emerge out of technology. Barrow-Giles and Yearwood analyze the constitutional moment that the transition to republicanism in Barbados has presented to the Commonwealth Caribbean. They use the broad backdrop of the independence movement in the region as a juxtaposition for understanding the Republican movement by making selected forays into the political history of various Commonwealth Caribbean countries as a means of highlighting the constitutional challenges that lie ahead. My article is designed to elicit the harsh realities of politics and the presidency in relation to the exercise of powers of the presidency of Trinidad and Tobago. This analysis is conducted through the prism of constitutional interpretation of the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President and its associated controversies. Ladies and gentlemen, that more or less is a synopsis and overview of what we want to talk about this morning. But for a more focused and direct discussion, I will invite my various colleagues who have contributed to this special edition to make a presentation, a brief presentation to you this morning in respect of their particular contributions to the special edition. So I'd now like to invite Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles and Mr. Rico Yearwood to make their contribution. Cynthia, good morning.
Yes, good morning, and thank you, Professor Ghany. I'm just going to speak very briefly. My colleague and I have already decided how we are going to approach the few minutes that we were given to make our presentation. But as Professor Ghany indicated, our paper is really dealing with monarchism to republicanism, that is the route from a monarchical system of government to a republican system of government across the English-speaking Caribbean. And we're looking at the pathways, the progress, and of course, the pitfalls. Now, I think it's important for us to share with our audience that when you take a very quick look at the reports of the various commissions that have been established to look into the question of whether or not the Caribbean should in fact terminate its relationship with the British, that is its constitutional relationship with the British. Certainly, we would see that in the last maybe 30 years or so, and certainly in the last 2 decades, republicanism has in fact been one of the major demands coming out from those reports that we have seen. Just for reference, by way of reference, we have the St. Lucia Constitution Reform Commission, which submitted its report after 5 years of deliberation. Very deep consultation, and it did call for constitutional change to a republic, with the main argument being that a constitutional monarchical system should in fact and ought to be abolished, with a republican constitutional system replacing that previous post-independence relationship. A similar position was held in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the only dispute in St. Vincent and the Grenadines really was the manner of selection of the head of state. So I'm happy to hear that, of course, Professor Ghany's paper will look at the relationship between the president and prime ministers, for instance. That republicanism in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was frustrated was in fact due in no small measure, I believe, to the open hostility of the parliamentary opposition to the entire package of reform, and in particular to the mixed method of selection of parliamentary representatives, and of course the method of selection of the president. But to get to our paper, the main thrust of our paper is that constitutionally, the Commonwealth Caribbean is in fact on the cusp of one of its greatest politically transformative periods in the modern era, certainly since the post-independence period. We note in our paper that there have been various amendments to our independent constitutions, but that to date, only 4 Commonwealth Caribbean countries have transitioned to the Republic, with Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and of course, Dominica, and more recently, Barbados in 2021. We take our point of reference in the paper as the transition of Barbados to a republic on November the 30th of 2021, which was in fact more than 20 years after the last Constitutional Reform Commission had been established in Barbados with the very specific mandate to make recommendations to address the system of government, and of course to make recommendations for a more effective and efficient government. All of that it was assumed would in fact position Barbados for the future. In 1998, the commission, which was established by the then government, submitted its report, and of course its flagship recommendation was a termination of monarchy in Barbados, in the political order of Barbados, and the suggestion and the recommendation that Barbados should transit to a republic. That of course never took place for a number of reasons. It is not really an open discussion, and so there's a lot of speculation, but certainly what we saw since then, in just a matter of 2-3 years ago, we did see the very swift transition of Barbados to republic. And I say swift because it took place less than 9 months after the Republican Transition Advisory Committee had been established in the country. And that, of course, followed the declaration that Barbados would become a republic on 30th November 2021. For us, that was in fact quite remarkable. It's remarkable for a number of reasons. So we make the case that this seemingly seamless transition was precedent setting in the Caribbean. And of course, it had implications and it had an impact, I would say, across the Caribbean. It in fact set the stage for the other Commonwealth Caribbean countries, the remaining constitutional monarchies, to follow suit. And indeed, it in fact ignited, I would argue, a debate globally, even among more settled Commonwealth realms. Take, for instance, Australia and certainly Canada, just to name those 2 countries. However, we note in our paper that the transition has to be understood within the context of a very special historical moment, a very special constitutional moment, a very special political moment, and these moments are in fact not uniformly replicated everywhere in the Commonwealth Caribbean. In fact, I don't think it is replicated anywhere in the Caribbean. And that is why we have to talk about the pitfalls, the progress, etc., and the hopes of constitutional reform across the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean countries. In our paper, we therefore contend that the different political constitutional context holds the distinct possibility that the remaining monarchies may experience some political and constitutional challenges in effecting the transition. In the article, we therefore explore the unique historical and political circumstances in Barbados leading to the Republican transition. And as Professor Ghany indicated, we contrast those circumstances with the existing circumstances elsewhere in the Commonwealth Caribbean. So we do contend that while the current moment offers potential for reform across the Caribbean, we recognize and acknowledge that there remains some not insurmountable constitutional and indeed political hurdles which may in fact hinder the other constitutional monarchies in making that transition. And I'll ask Rico to continue.
Thank you very much, Professor Barrow-Giles. After that excellent synopsis, I'm not even sure that I need to say anything else. But what I would do is amplify on some of the points you made. We started our paper by looking at an overview of the contemporary constitutional reform in the region. And we found that out of all the processes, the one adopted by Guyana between the years 1999 and 2003 was perhaps the most excellent model we could look at, and is because it transpired within such a cooperative environment, not least because you had a lot of external forces looking on, CARICOM being a prime example, ensuring that the process was seamless, because this arose out of severe and deep ethnic and racial tensions in Guyana, and the entire nation and political stability in Guyana was at stake. We also acknowledge that constitutional reform in the region doesn't always benefit from this deliberative or participatory democracy, meaning that is usually undertaken without much public engagement or meaningful public engagement, and this usually results in a lot of consternation about the moral and political authority of such reform. The second section of our paper, we looked at how Commonwealth Caribbean constitutions are sometimes enablers, but also disablers of constitutional reform. And it may sound paradoxical. How can something be an enabler and a disabler at the same time? Enabler in the sense that the constitution itself, or these constitutions in the Commonwealth Caribbean, allow for them to be altered, but disablers in the sense that there's usually a very high threshold to be met for these constitutional alterations to be made. In most Commonwealth Caribbean states, the Constitution requires either a 2/3 or a 3/4 vote in Parliament, and also the holding of a referendum, which also has to be supported by a simple majority or a supermajority vote as well. And that is a very high threshold. In the Commonwealth Caribbean, we call it constitutional entrenchment, but I prefer the terminology used by Professor Richard Albert Best when he called them constitutional handcuffs. And when you think about it, handcuffs don't absolutely prevent you from moving your hands, but they do restrict you from moving them to a very high degree. And I think it's something similar here. And especially in those countries where you have a referendum, we know that they don't do too well in the Caribbean region. They usually fail. So then that is a possible hurdle for constitutional reform for countries who actually want to transition to Republican status. And we also noted that this constitutional entrenchment is usually compounded by hyper partisanship, where political parties in our adversarial system usually oppose for opposing's sake. And if you need those numerical votes in Parliament and you can't get them, then that also is another potential hurdle for constitutional reform and republicanism in the Caribbean. So what we did, as Professor Barrow-Giles alluded to, we basically contrasted Barbados's constitutional context with the others in the Caribbean, and we found that it was relatively easy and simple for Barbados to make that transition, because in Barbados we only need 2/3 majority vote in both houses of Parliament. And considering that the government at the time held majority of the seats, a supermajority in Parliament, that was relatively easy to do. However, you can't necessarily say the same for other constitutional monarchies who intend, or so they have said, to transition to Republican status. For instance, we had the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs from Jamaica. She was commenting on the issue when Jamaicans were calling for Republican transition, and she said that, I quote, unlike Jamaica, they, meaning Barbados, did not require a vote from the people to make that important change in their constitution, because Jamaica is obviously one of the countries where you need a referendum before you can make any constitutional changes of such a nature to facilitate Republican status. And we then look at Barbados setting the stage for what we call a reactivated discourse, constitutional discourse about republicanism. We said that republicanism had to be done in Barbados by the hook or the crook. And we first looked at the fact that the first Constitution Commission, the Cox Commission, in 1977 recommended that we retain our monarchical system, because that's what majority of the Barbadian populace wanted. A few years later, however, the climate had considerably changed, and the Ford Commission noted that we should have a Republican system with a native president, and that is because at that point in time, the views of Barbadians had changed and they wanted this Republican system. However, this recommendation, as both Professor Barrow-Giles and Professor Ghany said, it withered on the vine because it was not implemented. Nothing happened with it. So 7 years later, we had a referendum act which was passed in Barbados to facilitate the holding of a referendum, and the question to be decided or answered is, should we implement the recommendation from the Ford Commission, which is to transition to Republican status? So we had the act passed, but the referendum was never held, and therefore, again, nothing happened. Then a decade later, in 2015, the then Prime Minister announced that Barbados would become a republic in the near future, whatever that meant. But perhaps that was just lip service because, again, nothing was done. And if you were holding your breath at that point in time, you would have surely died. So we then found that the Republican opportunity presented itself to Barbados between 1979 and 2015, and that opportunity was squandered 4 times over. But obviously, we know all of that changed in September 2020, when the government of Barbados, led by Prime Minister Motley, through the throne speech, announced that Barbados would become a republic the following year for independence. And this announcement sent shockwaves not just throughout the region, but the entire world, because like Professor Ghany alluded to at the beginning, since this is an announcement that was made more than 40 years after a Caribbean country had delinked itself from the British monarchy. But as Professor Ghany alluded to, this process that Barbados, even though it was swift, the process did not escape criticism. There were some criticisms about not setting up the Constitution Commission and about not first consulting the public to consider whether or when the Republican transition should occur. But Prime Minister Motley defended the government's position by stating that since the Ford Commission and the former administrations had previously given their blessing for Barbados to become a republic, any further deliberation was otiose or unnecessary. The government also set up this Republican Status Transition Advisory Committee, which was to help plan and manage the transition to Barbados, from a monarchical to Republican system. And the committee also had to make recommendations on certain related matters to the transition to republic, about what type of president or what type of republic we should have. And this committee, too, was criticized by 2 academics, one of them being Professor Barrow-Giles, of course, who deemed the committee unfit for purpose. And considering the fact that this committee was to do so much that it still has not done, it then begs the question, what even was the purpose of the committee to begin with? And also, it was criticized for its restricted membership. Some commentators believe that it was not reflective of a wide cross-section of different groups in society. So the membership was quite restricted. And so while the Barbadian public was in favor of transitioning, overwhelmingly, they were in favor of transitioning to Republican status, they didn't necessarily like the way in which it was being done. There were actually some people calling for more public education, more public engagement, and to a lesser degree, some were even calling for a referendum on the issue. But Prime Minister Motley took the criticisms in stride, and the government was not going to be deterred. Like she said, the year before, Barbados did become a republic in November 2021, and it had to be done by the hook or the crook. And this provided the impetus for political leaders across the Caribbean in other constitutional monarchies to reinitiate discussions about the possibility of adopting a republican system of government. Countries such as Jamaica, Antigua, the Bahamas, Belize, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia were all seemingly inspired by Barbados's transition. So even though Barbados' transition was not the smoothest, it boldly set the scene for the remaining monarchies to transition to republics in the future. And we concluded essentially by saying that in countries, these other constitutional monarchies that exist today, in those countries with what we refer to as the constitutional handcuffs, instead of there being hyper-partisanship there must be a good measure of bipartisanship. And if a referendum especially is to be held, there must be significant and meaningful engagement with the public, because cat luck is not dog luck. It was easy for Barbados because of our unique and special constitutional context, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be easy for the rest because of their peculiar constitutional context and circumstances as well. And that is really our paper in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia and Rico, for your opening presentations with respect to your paper. And let me just say, for the benefit of those who are listening and viewing, that you can send your comments or questions in the chat to me, and I'll be able to read them out so we can start having a discussion after the last presenter makes their presentation. So it's my pleasure now to invite our next presenter, Dr. Derek O'Brien, a reader in public law at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. And we welcome him. Derek, welcome, and we look forward to hearing you now.
Hi, Hamid. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the special issue. And thanks also to Rico and Cynthia for their presentation, because it neatly segues into what I want to say about my own paper. So in my paper, I wanted to explore the origins of republicanism in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominica and Barbados, and to try and highlight the very particular combination of social, political and constitutional factors that enabled these countries to transition to republicanism, or in the case of Dominica, to embark upon independence as a republic. And I wanted to use that to inform my discussion of the challenges that face the remaining realms in the region, political, social and constitutional, as they sought to become republics, but with a particular focus on the case of Jamaica. And I thought that Jamaica made a very interesting case study for three reasons. Firstly, because Jamaica, together with Trinidad and Tobago, was in the vanguard of the independence movement in the 1960s. And yet, almost 50 years since Trinidad and Tobago became a republic, Jamaica remained a constitutional monarchy. And I'm sure that isn't because Jamaicans are any less anti-colonial than Trinidadians. The second reason why Jamaica makes for an interesting case study is simply because the journey or the path to republicanism in Jamaica has just been so incredibly tortuous. As I explain in my paper, the timeline stretches back to Michael Manley in 1972, who, upon becoming Prime Minister, established a constitutional review commission with the intention of Jamaica becoming a republic by 1981. And since then, power has switched back and forth between the two main political parties. Prime ministers have come and gone. There have been several joint select committees of parliament. There have been constitutional review commissions, all of which have consistently recommended that Jamaica should become a republic. Then most recently in 2020, the new government made a firm promise upon winning the general elections that it would become Jamaica would hold a referendum on whether it should become a republic by 2025. And then the third reason why I think Jamaica makes for an interesting case study is that it will be, if it does hold a referendum, it will be the first country in the region to hold a referendum on whether or not it should become a republic. All the other republics, as Cynthia and Rico have pointed out, either became republics because they had majority votes in their legislatures, or because, as in the case of Dominica, they embarked upon independence as a republic. So it will be the first country in the region to have a referendum on whether it should be a republic, and indeed the third country in the entire Commonwealth to hold a referendum on whether it should become a republic, the others being the Gambia and Australia. And the recent opinion polls in Jamaica, so an opinion poll conducted in 2022 seemed to show that a majority of Jamaicans were very much in support of it becoming a republic. I think the figures were 56% in favor of Jamaica becoming a republic. As I understand it, more recent opinion polls have shown a significant decline in the number of those surveyed who wanted Jamaica to become a republic. Most recently in 2023, only 45% of those surveyed said that they supported it becoming a republic. Obviously, for those who support the Republican cause, this is a worrying development, particularly when you think that prior to the referendum in Australia in 1999, the vast majority of Australians said that they would support Australia becoming a republic. Yet in the subsequent referendum, the vote was 55 against and only 45% in favor. Now, of course, opinion polls can be wrong, and Jamaica is not Australia. But as Rico and Cynthia adverted to, governments in the Commonwealth Caribbean have a very poor record when it comes to winning constitutional referendums on constitutional reform. Only one country, Guyana, back in 1979, in a referendum that's widely believed to have been rigged, won a referendum. In every other constitutional referendum that's taken place since independence, the government has lost. And again, as Cynthia and Rico have adverted to, the principal reason why they've lost is because there's been a lack of bipartisan support for the constitutional reform that's been proposed. And this is, I think this is a worry, because I think Jamaica either has or is about to reach this point. So the two main political parties started on the basis that both parties wanted Jamaica to become a republic, and that's the basis on which the Constitutional Reform Commission was formed. But more recently, the opposition, the party in Jamaica, has said, or insisted, in fact, that if there is to be a referendum on whether Jamaica should be a republic, it should also include a question on whether Jamaica should replace the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council with the Caribbean Court of Justice as its final court. The government, however, has dug its heels in and is saying, no, that's for phase 2 of the constitutional reform program. For phase 1, we're concentrating on Jamaica becoming a republic. So the result of that has been that the opposition members of the Constitutional Reform Commission, 3 of them, have actually refused to sign the report that the Constitutional Reform Commission submitted to Cabinet. And the worry is that if there is this visible lack of consensus amongst the members of the Constitutional Reform Commission who are recommending whether Jamaica should become a republic or not, it's going to be more difficult to obtain public buy-in at the level of the referendum. So my worry is that the prospect of Jamaica becoming a republic anytime soon are receding daily. And if, as now seems likely, the government isn't going to be able to keep to its promise to hold the referendum in time for the 2025 elections, and it seems to be indicating that the referendum will now take place after the 2025 elections, there's no guarantee that the Jamaican Labour Party will win those elections. And we're now in a position where we don't know when or even if Jamaica will become a republic, which I would say is a profound disappointment to the other realms in the region that were looking to Jamaica to take the lead in becoming a republic via referendum, just as it took the lead in becoming an independent country back in 1962. So, sorry, that in essence is the nub of my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for your presentation. And I'll just remind our audience that you can send your comments and questions in the chat to me so that I can read the questions out when we get to that stage of our proceedings. So I want now to invite Dr. Henderson Carter, Senior Lecturer in History at the Department of History and Philosophy, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill in Barbados. Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Professor Ghany, and good morning, everyone. My paper is entitled 55 Years in the Doldrums, Barbados's Protracted Move to Republicanism. And in the paper, I sought to answer that question as to why it took so long for Barbados to move to that Republican status, especially in the light of the fact that Barbados economically was doing pretty well after the 1960s. It had some very strong prime ministers, people like Errol Barrow, Grantley Adams, Tom Adams rather, Owen Arthur, Frendo Stewart. And I wanted to find out what are the reasons for this long delay, over 55 years before we reach that status. And I said that I would go back to the imperial project. In other words, I wouldn't begin at 1966. I will look back at that British project to establish a colony here in Barbados, to establish what I call these imperial bonds, political bonds, social bonds, economic bonds, to try to explain the reasons. And I came up with 4 reasons. The first is that the delay in Republican status occurred because of the strong colonial and imperial bonds here in Barbados, and of course in other countries as well. For example, nearly every 5 years, we had what we call imperial visits from the Queen. But beyond that, we also had large coronations. As a matter of fact, in the 1950 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, Barbados had its own coronation celebrations that lasted over 2 days. And then we have what I call the celebratory days. Trafalgar Day, October 21st. Empire Day, May 24th. Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th. Even a Peacemakers Day. So the point that I'm making is that these imperial celebrations created fondness and affection for the monarchy and the empire. But that even after these celebrations were ended in 1966 by Errol Barrow, that the fondness for empire still continued. The fondness for the Queen still continued. So that in February 1966, when Queen Elizabeth came here to open the East Coast Highway, there were thousands of people who descended on Belle Plaine, that section of the northeast coast of Barbados, to watch the Queen open that highway. So my first point in the presentation in the paper was that if you want to explain the delay in going to republicanism, you have to look at the strength of those colonial bonds. The second point relates to the exercise of British power at the moment of independence. That is in around June, July 1966. Barrow went up to Britain to take the case to the colonial office, but he was not in any position to move towards a full break. As a matter of fact, Barrow was required to come back to Barbados and hold a general election to get a mandate, even before the British government considered his independence bill. So that is why a general election was held in November 1966, just about 20 or so days before independence was conceived. In addition to that, when the British recognized that the Barbados flag will still contain some symbols, some British symbols like the broken trident, the members of Parliament were very happy with the fact that Barbados was retaining some of these British symbols. And I want to quote Edward Duncan, a member of Parliament for Taunton. He says, on November 30th, that flag comes down, and comes down forever, meaning the British flag, to be replaced by another, the design of which we have all seen, and which happily preserves a sentimental link with Great Britain, preserves that sentimental link. In addition, and quite curiously, at the moment of independence, the Barbados police force was renamed, not that, renamed the Royal Barbados Police Force, as if to suggest that this British tag, this British influence would still continue after 1966. And of course, the Queen was kept as the head of state here in Barbados. So the point I'm making, therefore, that at independence, Barrow was not in any strong position to break totally with Britain, and therefore it suggests the exercise of British power at the moment of independence. My third point relates to what happened in Barbados at independence and, of course, after. Now, for about 13 months, from 1965 to 1966, there was considerable pushback here in Barbados to the idea of independence alone. Many of the political parties opposed that idea. They wanted independence as a federation. Barrow took the view that he would go to independence alone and lost two of his prominent cabinet members. Not only that, but the white community in Barbados and several other persons came out supporting disagreeing with Barrow's position about independence alone. Some people wanted independence, the crown, the British crown, to remain forever. And of course, there was some migration out of Barbados to places like Australia and New Zealand because of this political storm. And of course, after 1966, you see more pushback so that the Cox Commission could report that Barbados was not ready to remove the Queen as head of state. And of course, that pushback was also seen with the attempted or the debate over Lord Nelson and the fact that people were calling for Nelson's removal from the 1970s throughout the 1980s. So that pushback was important. Pushback at the time of independence, pushback at the time after independence. The fourth point that I raise in the essay has to do with what I call Motley's decisive leadership. And Motley is riding on a political crest. There's a 30-love defeat of the Democratic Labour Party in 2018. And then the other political crest is the moving of Lord Nelson, November 16th, 2020. That comes as a result of an online petition by Alex Downs, who's one of my former students, an online petition to remove Nelson. So she could sense the the temperature and the fact that Barbadians were now changing their views with respect to the monarchy, with respect to the Queen and the British Empire. But Motley, I argued in the conclusion, has a different mindset, a mindset to confront global power structures. And this notion of the Queen being the head of state of Barbados, she was willing to confront that power structure. Of course, the other point that has to be noted is Motley's African orientation. The fact that after 2018, Motley has been moving towards Africa to create greater links with African countries. She's made several visits to Africa, invited heads of state from Africa to Barbados. And that tells me that leadership is important to make such a break, because it is true that Mr. Stewart, former Prime Minister Fundle Stewart, was talking about the matter. As a matter of fact, in 2015, in 2016, Stewart was of the view that, yes, Barbados should move towards republicanism, but no action had been taken. And I argue, therefore, that Motley took that decisive leadership to press ahead, and to press ahead quickly. And that's the point that was made earlier by our colleagues here on the call. So my paper, therefore, tried to explain why it took so long for Barbados to move to that stage of republicanism, why it took over 55 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henderson, for your opening statement. I'd like now to invite Dr. Alison Ramsey, lecturer in Cultural Heritage Studies, Department of History, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Ramsey, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good day. Thank you, Chair. My article is entitled From Little England to a Republic, The Journey of Barbados, and it seeks to chronicle Barbados' journey to a Republican status, highlighting the final events and debates leading up to Barbados cutting colonial ties with Queen Elizabeth II as head of state, and the declaration of the Republic and installation of the first president of Barbados, Dame Sandra Mason, as the head of state in 2021. I also look at some of social and economic effects of Barbados' transition in Barbados and in some Caribbean countries. Firstly, I seek to offer some historical context and chronology in discussing this journey to becoming a republic, arguing that this did not take place just in 1966 when the country became independent, or in 2021 when the country was declared a republic. Rather, this struggle for freedom and independence started from the 17th century when Barbadians were under colonial rule. And from inception, at various moments in time, the people of Barbados sought to change their colonial relationship, as evidenced through various acts of resistance. In examining the 20th century attempts to transition to republicanism, I note the importance of the 1978 Cox Commission, named after its chair, Cynthia Cox. And this commission would have concluded that Barbados was not yet ready for this transition. And this contrasted with the conclusion of the Ford Commission, named after its chair, Sir Henry Ford, in 1998, that said Republican status was the direction to go. We had several prime ministers in the 20th and 21st century, discussing whether or not we should go towards this under the Tom Adams administration, under the Owen Arthur administration, and under the Fundle Stewart administration. Eventually, in 2021, it was announced that Barbados would become a republic, and this is a feat achieved under Barbados's first female Prime Minister, Mia Motley. And I also thought at the time it was going to be important to capture some of the perspectives of Barbadians through debates that circulated at the time on traditional and social media as to whether, for example, a referendum should be held about the timing of the transition, about the lack of or not enough public education about what it means to become a republic, and the avid discussions on the choice of Independence Day, November 30th, to also be the day for this transition of a republic. Now, it's also important to note that the declaration of the Republic and installation of the president also took place in our UNESCO World Heritage Site, Historic Bridgetown, its garrison. The Independence Day Parade happened at the Garrison Savannah, and now the Republic transition happened in Bridgetown at National Heroes Square. Ironically, it's also the same location where the controversial Lord Horatio Nelson statue stood just 1 year prior before it was decommissioned after being in the city since the 19th century. In this article, I also examine some of the social and economic effects of this transition to republicanism in the island, such as the Royal Barbados Police Force being renamed Barbados Police Force, the imperial honors being replaced with a range of Barbadian honors, such as the Freedom of Barbados, which would be former knighthoods, and the Order of the Republic, formerly the Companion of Honor. But of course, even though we've had some changes, some things have remained the same. For example, if we look at our place names, some of them that commemorate royalty continue to exist, such as Prince William Henry Street, Queen's Park, Queen Elizabeth Hospital, King George V Park. Now, of course, changes such as political status would raise the question of whose heritage and what history is being preserved. And of course, the erasure of remnants of colonial rule is not the solution to grappling with the effects of colonialism into the 21st century, but it's part of the history and contested heritage of Barbados and England that both nations will have to continue to navigate. I also examined a little bit about how did this have a regional impact relating to Barbados becoming a republic. And it also generated some reactions in other Caribbean territories, such as Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Belize, and Jamaica. And this was a bit different in terms of what was happening in the 1970s when Dominica, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago became republics. Perhaps it has to do with the timing of the transition of Barbados and the current worldview on the relevance of the monarchy, as well in terms of these debates about whether or not we should cut our ties and whether more of this will happen in the region. At the time as well, several government ministers in the region renewed their call to reparations as well. I conclude in this paper that Barbados becoming independent was an essential first step in attaining decolonization, and becoming a republic is another part of this process. It represents a very important part of how the nation continues to break shackles from being Britain's first Black slave society to becoming the first country in the Caribbean to achieve republican status in the 21st century. And of course, both independence and republicanism are important elements in continuing to build nationhood and Barbadian identity as the country continues to navigate its colonial past, this post-colonial world, and the era of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for your opening presentation. I'd now like to invite Dr. Pearson Broome. And just before I do that, just to say that the chat is closed at the moment, and it will be opened after the last presenter, who is Dr. Broome, because that's when we go to the question and answer session. And at that stage, you'll be able to send your questions in the chat to me, and I can then read the questions out and have the presenters respond. So let me now invite Dr. Pearson Broome, who is a lecturer in political science at the Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. Dr. Broome.
Good morning, Professor Ghany and colleagues. My paper is titled Constitutional Reform for the Digital Era. Now, it is a conceptual paper, and after the death of the British sovereign, there was much discussion going on, coming from all quarters, that now that she's gone, we ought to get rid of the old monarchical status and become a republic. And my paper pretty much looked at the fact that I think republicanism, or the move to republicanism, or constitutional reform should involve more than just moving from a monarch to a president, or concerns about prime ministerial power, or some of the old institutional ideas that exist. And the idea was that we need to be more concerned, we need to be equally concerned about how our societies are changing. And when I did the review of all of the literature, I started off with the likes of Trevor Monroe, and came straight up to the 2020 volume that Albert, Derek, O'Brien, and Barrow-Giles and the others have done. I read through all that, and most of the literature dealt with, as I said, the traditional institutional approaches, you know, how should the state be reformed, the role for the different actors, etc. So I decided to look at how technology will reshape several of those institutions. And I'm concerned, for example, about technology and constitutional reform, primarily because there are those who believe that such ideas are engaging in futurology, that in some cases, they're not totally relevant to the argument of constitutional reform. And I have taken a different view. I'm of the strong belief that we have to be able to think about how digital technologies will impact governance within the Caribbean. And the paper raised some questions. For example, with the growth of human knowledge and capability, how will Caribbean constitutions operate in 2087? Are they fit for purpose as more and more of our citizens go online? And another question that was raised, recognizing the overwhelming role of technologies in shaping public discussion and debate, etc., can democratic leaders reach consensus on how to address core policy problems, such as establishing coherent rules about personal data protection and privacy, while still devising guidelines for the responsible use of emerging technologies? And then, in a world of surveillance and psychographic manipulation, now, when I mention psychographic manipulation, that would be persons taking information and repurposing it for their own, let's say, political use, to be able to put out there to encourage others as to how they're going to try to encourage or influence how they should think about a particular issue. So the paper, for example, is invoking those involving constitutional reform to start to think about how the different mechanisms of the state will have to respond to information and communication technologies in a digital era. And with so many of our Caribbean persons disengaged from the quote-unquote analog world, the paper pretty much argues for a cyberspace corollary, where we have to now start thinking about how are we going to be able to manage that cyberspace world. For the Barbadians here, our Prime Minister, in an attempt to be progressive, boldly announced that we are going to go towards a metaverse. What that means, for example, for Barbados, we are not so sure as yet. So it's something that, if she's serious about it, and I'm told that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is supposed to be working on it, what does that mean? will there be a constitution, since Barbados will be the first country in the metaverse for the metaverse? So the paper, for example, looked at use, for example, the approach of digital constitutionalization, where to a large extent, the idea behind it is that we have to be able to think about how our constitution is being reformed, or what are some of the challenges that it will have to undergo as digital technologies take greater root within the society. And we have to be concerned primarily because the technologies integrating within society are raising several legal issues. And the challenge with the technology is that it is moving so fast that the legal architecture, therefore, must be able to understand the complexity, the ambiguity, and the novelty of how these technologies will be reshaping different aspects of our societies. So I use figurative language with the Constitution as a lighthouse to signal to policy planners and constitutional reformers to be mindful of how technological development is taking place is emerging within Caribbean society, and how these technologies will force a reformatting of how we think about constitutional reform. So for those who are wondering about what are some of the issues that I attempted to address, the issues of surveillance, some of the major trends taking place within our democracies, the idea of surveillance, where to a large extent, again, the multinational corporations are able to manipulate information, use it in such a way, for example, where it can be corrosive to political debate, and therefore it can affect the quality of democracy. I think we are very mindful, and we must be very mindful of the role of artificial intelligence. And if you've been following the American elections and other elections elsewhere, you'll be seeing, for example, deep fakes, which are images still moving that approximate reality, where you can inject words into someone's mouth. So the person you see is the person you know, but they're not saying the things that they're saying in the particular clip, if it's a video or a still piece. So artificial intelligence, for example, is to a large extent destabilizing or distorting policy debates. And Yeboah mentioned, for example, that this idea of artificial intelligence was very powerful across the 2020 elections in Africa, where it was used, for example, to destabilize national politics. Another concern raised in the paper was that of free speech. And one of the ideas about free speech, if a democracy is supposed to operate on free speech and it is being manipulated by multinationals at your Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc., can we then see free speech as a luxury? Or do we have to be able to rethink how free speech is being used to reshape participation, empowerment, and the democratic process? The other concern that we have to be able to address, and what the paper dealt with, is that now you can use algorithms in order to reshape the conversation within the political system through social media. So the challenge that you have there is that you can have an elite group of persons who are good at controlling the technologies and manipulating them for their personal use, determining what will be on the policy agenda. And in some cases, that would lead to the tyranny of the minority, primarily because it's a select group of persons or countries, for example, trying to reshape what are the ideas that a government should use to govern the society. The paper also addressed issues of data protection and privacy. With reference to data protection and privacy, how should we think about privacy now with the advent of social media platforms? But also it addressed the issue of the digital body. The digital body would be how persons interact with technologies in cyberspace. So increasingly, you have personalities created online that are outside the scope of your analog regulations and laws, etc. And then we also have to be mindful of adaptive authoritarianism, which the paper addresses. Now, with adaptive authoritarianism, a government based on its threat can use technologies, for example, to redefine free speech. And they can use technologies in a way to be able to manipulate public opinion. They can use it for surveillance, for example. So one of the things that we have to be able to look at with adaptive authoritarianism is that a government can pretty much use the information, use the technologies in such a way where they can repress viewpoints that emerge from any dissenting opinion. And you can do that, for example, by throttling the internet, where you can slow down the pace of the internet. There have been instances in Singapore, for example, where the government must have access to what members of civil society are doing. You can use, for example, keyword blocking, where state in collaboration with an ISP can use the technologies, for example, to weed out any activist words or any words within the internet that they perceive as undermining their rule. So technologies, for example, can bring the illiberal democracy that Fareed Zakaria would have spoken about in a very easier way. Then we also have to be able to think about net neutrality. That's still an ongoing debate within our democratic systems. And how do small island developing states think about net neutrality? Now, net neutrality, for example, the debate going on is that all information online should be treated equally. Everyone should have access to that technology, for example. Everyone should have the same access to whatever information is appearing. But large service providers are against it. So you're asking, so what does that mean for me? Well, to a large extent, what can happen is that if the internet service providers get their way, they can determine what access to information you have, for example, on Google. So they will want you to pay for access to information and data. And again, that can affect the quality of knowledge, access to knowledge that are all important for free speech, etc. The other concerns we have to be able to think of would be digital rights for the disabled. How are they included in constitutional reform? Waller would have addressed issues like this in a paper that he did, because the technologies must respond to all elements of all persons within the society. And it is not necessarily the case that the technologies always allow for visual, tactile, and oral communications. And another feature that we have to be able to think about for the digital rights of the disabled, how do we define the disabled and the kind of public accommodations necessary for the disabled, primarily because generally public accommodations are no longer restricted to a physical space, but you now also have to think about an online space where the disabled do not feel alienated or marginalized. Now, another concern that the paper raised was perhaps a call for regional constitutionalism. Technologies have the capacity to be interoperable. The Secretary General of CARICOM lamented the fact that to this day, we still do not have a CARICOM ICT space. Yet we want to create a CARICOM single market and economy. And information is the bedrock of the functioning of any market. The paper therefore asks the question, since we missed the opportunity to be a truly regional grouping in the 1960s when Federation failed, and most of the other integration movements have been ad hoc and suboptimal in their performance. Isn't this the time now to perhaps experiment and ask the question, if we cannot move towards a regional constitution, recognizing that this CARICOM single market and economy has been elusive throughout the whole integration movement. So it raises that question about looking at this regional constitution. And a regional constitution because the African Union also had proposed the creation of an international constitutional court for the protection of the right to democracy, recognizing that throughout the Caribbean, our democracies have not performed the way how they should. Isn't this an idea that we should take on board with reference to having a more concerted approach to how we protect democracy, how we enhance democracy, and if we're truly interested in regional integration and we did write a CARICOM Charter for Civil Society, how best can we integrate all of these facets into a regional constitution? So it placed that idea out there. And then we also have to start thinking, we've heard a lot about e-voting. So the paper addressed the issue about how should we think about e-voting going forward? Should we consider it as important? And if so, what are some of the considerations that we need to think of? Now, e-voting has emerged primarily because you've heard members of the diaspora constantly argue they should be allowed to vote. They're Barbadians, they're Trinidadians, Jamaicans, etc. They should be allowed to participate in their country. So how do we conceptualize e-voting within our society? Now, one of the things that we have to be able to think of is that there are those who would argue, well, do you need a constitution for that? Why not just have legislation, for example, as what we're trying to do in Barbados with cybersecurity legislation, or some adjunct piece of legislation to address these issues? The challenge with this is that they never work well, they perform in a very ad hoc way, and they're often not well crafted. So we need more fundamental approaches to how we deal with issues of digital rights online, issues of e-voting, how is sovereignty going to be impacted? How are we going to deal with unregulated artificial intelligence and what it could mean for our democracy, etc. And the paper concludes with the idea that governments, in embracing constitutional reform, must subject themselves to digital constitutionalization and the impact it will have on some of the key principles of constitutional reform, like sovereignty, freedom, equality, choice, participation. And again, I use the figurative language of the lighthouse, that the constitutions, when they're rewritten, must serve as a lighthouse to the future to determine how our societies will emerge. And they must be flexible enough to understand the challenges that will emerge and how they, if they can preempt some of those challenges, how best to address them. And listening to the panel today, constitutional reform has always been fraught with difficulty. And the constitutional reform efforts, for example, have not lived up to expectations in terms of after the reports have been written. So the paper ends with a kind of a catharsis, recognizing then that constitutional reform is so difficult to achieve, and what to include and what to exclude is so problematic, tenuous, contentious, etc. Why not then use artificial intelligence with ChatGPT to write the perfect constitution? And that's pretty much how my paper went. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pearson, for your presentation. So, colleagues and those of you who are online looking at this, we can start getting your questions now. The chat was disabled during the period of presentations. You can send your questions in the chat to me, and I will then relay the questions to participants so that they can then begin to answer some of the questions that we have. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, is there anything that anyone wants to engage among us as presenters in respect of the presentations this morning? And I'm throwing it open to all of the participants here. Is there any particular issue that came out from all that you've heard this morning that you would like to flag for some kind of further discussion? Derek, I see your hand up.
It was a question for Henderson, really. I was just curious. He was talking about the culture around the time of independence. I just wondered if there was a strong Republican movement in Barbados back in '66 as Barbados was transitioning to independence.
Thank you, Derek. Well, I would say no strong Republican movement, but I would also say that in 1966, or even just before that, there were people in Barbados who were asking for the removal of some of these British symbols. For example, when our new hospital was constructed in 1964, there was a strong movement from a group to demand the renaming of the hospital. Now, it was called the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. This is 1964. And there was a group who came out and said, look, why call this the Queen Elizabeth Hospital? Okay. So I would say, therefore, that there wasn't a strong Republican movement at that time. But I would also make the point that that cleavage towards the British monarch delayed the process even further. That cleavage, that point of the celebratory days having an impact on people delayed that process, so that in 1979 we were still not ready for republicanism. Now, there's another point that I want to raise, and it comes out of the presentation by Alison about having republicanism, but yet you leave what we call the symbols and the place names intact, okay? And the question is, why rename only certain places? Now, in 2021, Government House was renamed State House, okay? And of course, our Governor General, that term was removed, and we replaced the Governor General with the President. But there were a lot of place names, British place names, that were still kept. Names like Queen Mary Road, Buckingham Road, Prince Alfred Street, George Street, King George V Memorial Park, even Scottish names. Now, I think that it would be total madness to replace all of those names, because Barbados would be unrecognizable. And that really points to the extent of the British colonial project. So that you move all of those place names from Britain, you imprint those names on Barbados, so that it's very, very difficult to remove. My suggestion to deal with that problem is to move towards incremental renaming. So let's say you build a new school, you name it after a Barbadian, or you build a new road, you rename it after a Barbadian. But to remove even the lion at Gun Hill, and to remove all of those names, Barbados will become unrecognizable. I don't think that is practical at this time, okay? But I think the central area, the central issue was the removal of the Queen as head of state, because between 1966 and 2021, politicians who were being sworn in swore allegiance to Queen Elizabeth II. And that some people found was detestable.
Okay, thank you, Henderson. I have a question that's come in on the chat, so I'll read it out. And the question is, two conceptions of republicanism are evident in the presentations. One, Pearson Broome used a conception of republicanism anchored on the sovereign of the people, where the people's voice matter in decision-making. Two, other presenters used the concept of republicanism anchored on the idea of moving the monarch as head of state. Do the other presenters agree with the concept of republicanism used by Pearson Broome? If so, how do the replacement of a foreign monarch with a local head of state achieve people's sovereignty, where the people's representatives make the law and not the executive? Any takers to respond to that particular question? And while you're pondering that, there's another one that's come in here. Sorry to be cynical. However, in the case of Jamaica, the distrust is that nothing apparently improves in the processing of basic rights and needs of the people. What really can be placed in constitution documents to make people believe in the process of government? This is even the best tenets of the existing constitution in regards to degrading, dehumanizing treatment of persons continues. Will the authorities and people at large pay any attention to new frameworks? Jamaica is not a signatory to the International Court of Criminal Justice, thus no real penalties can be placed, etc. National Housing Trust, for example, takes funds from all Jamaicans, but not all can even begin to qualify for a house or any assistance to retrofit their dwellings. And then I have another response here. Good afternoon. A question for Dr. Broome. Great presentation. Can AI achieve any approximation of an ideal for a self-governing people who are attempting to reconstitute their polities? Right, so we have three issues before us. Anyone, Henderson and Derek have spoken, and I don't know if Cynthia, Rico, Alison want to say anything?
Can I go to the, should I go to the last question?
Well, no one has stepped forward, so if you're going to step forward, yes, let's do it.
Right, so when I spoke about AI for the writing of the Constitution, I was pretty much being cynical, because we've been at this process now of constitutional reform, constitutional reports being written, persons going up and down the length of the Caribbean trying to understand what the Constitution should involve, what they want to see in it. And therefore, since we are now using AI for everything, it seems, the cynical question would be, let's see what it can do to resolve some of these some of these challenges that are emerging with reference to how best should governance be conducted and understood within the Caribbean. But I wouldn't be so naive to see it as the end all and be all of how a constitution ought to be crafted. But I just threw it out there to pretty much say to everyone, well, you know, well, if you want to get rid of all of this first, let's see what it should be like. With reference to the first one, with sovereignty of the people, the technologies are leading to sovereignty of the people. The voices are coming via the technology, social media. The technologies are contradictory in a way. They can empower, but they can also disempower. And therefore, if we're going to have constitutional reform, we have to be able to look at some of the formal structures of governance. Does the Prime Minister really have as much people when social media hits the road? And we've seen that we've seen prime ministers in the Caribbean having to recapitulate on some of their policies when the groundswell from social media emerged, and they had to reshape policies, refine policies. During COVID, for example, we saw the people making it very difficult for coherent policies to be framed regarding how COVID should be treated, what sort of healthcare policies should be put in place. So the idea, and why I use an institutionalist theory perspective, is that institutionalism allows you to not only look at the formal institutions of governance, but you also have to be able to think about the quality of the environment that exists, the normative values of the people. What are their views? And the views of the persons now are being reshaped more by foreign influences than ever before, because information is at their fingertips on every single device. And unless we are able to marry those institutional arrangements and the institutional environment to understand how democracy is being changed, then we are not going to be able to craft constitutions that are going to be durable for any length of time. I'll give you an example. Once upon a time, electoral fraud at the ballot box was committed with voting, etc. Now you have you must be able to think of electoral fraud with disinformation, where at the ballot box, persons are gaining information that will affect the integrity of the ballot. So a lot is changing around us, and most of it is an uncontrolled role, unregulated role of technologies in the society, impacting on how the society is being governed.
Okay, thank you, Pearson. Any other colleagues want to come in? Issues of trust in the process, the issue of laws and other things. Henderson, your hand is up. Yeah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Ghany. I want to respond to the first question. And the way I see it is different stages of constitutional development. The first stage, in my view, is to remove the monarch as head of state from our Caribbean countries. That's the first stage. The second stage is what Pearson is referring to, power to the people. But even at that stage, we have to be very careful because we don't want anarchy as well. So we have to carefully study and that issue of social media, because, you know, for example, people on social media are very knowledgeable, and some people also spread a lot of false news. So we need to have a conversation about social media and its influence and how we could move in the direction of more power to the people. So I just want to say that that is the second stage of our constitutional development.
Okay, Cynthia, your hand is up. Want to go ahead?
Yes. Thank you very much. I want to respond to the question which is in the chat right here. It's a quite involved question. I don't think in relation to, and my response to the question is like this. I don't think in relation to the presentations prior to Dr. Broome's presentation, I don't think that the presenters, and certainly not me, and certainly not Rico, I don't think any one of us were looked at republicanism as merely something which requires the shift from monarchical system to a more republican system. I think maybe because we are concerned with the moment right now and the response of people to the moment and the trajectory and the path that's going to be developed, our papers took a particular direction. But it's very clear, and certainly where I'm concerned, that you cannot speak about constitutional reform, the larger question of constitutional reform, because merely talking about republicanism is just one component, a small but important component of wider constitutional reform. And that when we speak about constitutional reform, certainly, to me, key or core to the issue of constitutional reform is how you place people at the center. To that extent, therefore, I would support Dr. Broome in his discussion of how you can, you can embrace more people by way of, social media, etc., into the Constitution. I would really like to hear some more about digital constitutionalism as against what I heard in the presentation. But I think it's important. Secondly, the second aspect of this question, and Henderson, I sort of disagree with you. I don't think that necessarily is a discrete approach to constitutional development or reform. I don't think that one, you have to remove the monarch in order for us to get the people more involved. So for me, it is not that you do this first and then you do the other. No. For me, constitutional reform, whether or not we in fact remove the monarch from our existing political form, requires that we place people at the center. Now, in relation to the second part of the question, I don't think any one of us really got into the issue of what is the appropriate political form that we need to pursue other than just the issue of republicanism. And so that we know that there are different types of republican forms. We know that in the main, what we have seen in the Commonwealth Caribbean is that we have pursued a parliamentary political form, so that essentially we have made little adjustments to our existing political institutions. There has been some talk about the move of some Caribbean countries to a presidential political form, and there are consequences in relation to that. So I was very intrigued, and unfortunately, Professor Ghany, you'll have to excuse me, but I was very intrigued when you spoke about, very briefly, the reference to your paper where you would have discerned and looked at more closely the relationship between the president and, in fact, the elected representatives. So I think for us to get to the issue of the second part of this question, how would the replacement of a foreign monarch with a local head of state achieve people's sovereignty, whether people's representatives make the law or not the executive? We have to get into a discussion, wider, broader, deeper discussion of what is the appropriate political model for the Commonwealth Caribbean states.
Thank you, Cynthia. Anyone else on the panel wants to respond to any of these questions that we have in the chat? The issue of trust has come up in terms of trusting the process, talking about fraudulent laws and other issues of that nature. Any other of the presenters want to address any of these questions that have been raised here by some of the persons in the chat? The most recent one I got is people are not interested in the general discussion and only want to live or hold a food, etc. They vote to get governments not to bother them choosing the lesser of evils. They say your game is academics, sports, or politics. Mine is have my dance hall music playing anytime, every place. So we're getting some various responses here. But I think one of the things that is coming through from the questions that I'm seeing, the issue about trust, is there that issue of trust between governments and the people, and to what extent is that impacting on the whole republicanism movement? Because it's obvious that there's been a long hiatus between Dominica in 1978 and Barbados in 2021, and we haven't seen much else going on. And as Derek was pointing out, Jamaica is in a kind of stalemate situation with the opposition whose votes are required in a parliamentary vote demanding that the CCJ be included in a bill to amend the constitution to make the country a republic, and the government not adopting that particular position. And of course, we are into an election year, the final year of a 5-year term in Jamaica. in respect of when an election is due. So Derek, I know you spoke a little bit about the question of the referendum not likely to be held before general election is held. You want to just develop that point a little more? I think you're still muted.
When this process started in 2020, it looked like the government had the wind in its sails, and there was a growing anti-monarchical sentiment across the region. There was Black Lives Matter. There were those disastrous royal tours. There was the toppling of the Colston statute in Bristol. There was the demonization of Meghan Markle. So everything seemed to point to this. Jamaica would perhaps be the first country in the region to hold a successful constitutional referendum. And it's just fascinating to me where it's all gone wrong. And I've tried, faithfully to read the minutes of the meetings of all of the Constitutional Reform Committee meetings, and it's very easy just to get lost in the weeds of it. And but it's also amazing that to me that perhaps it was the PNP, if we go back to Michael Manley, that was the most Republican party, has ended up. It looks as though they're now going to throw the spanner in the works by insisting on linking the CCJ issue with the issue of Jamaica becoming a republic. And I don't know. I'm the outsider. I mean, if there's anybody here from Jamaica who has some inside knowledge, but all the indicators up to me are that the issue might well get kicked into the long grass yet again. And can I just say something about the issue of trust, Hamid, which was raised?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Because I think the Barbados is really interesting in this respect, because I think a bit of an elephant in the room. I mean, Cynthia Rico might have touched upon it, but originally, following the report of the Ford Commission, Mia Mottley had promised that there would be a referendum before Barbados became a republic. And a referendum was going to be scheduled, and then it had to be abandoned because it felt it didn't quite have the resources to hold an election at the same time as a referendum. And then a number of years later, when Mia Mottley becomes Prime Minister, she abandons that promise. I mean, she herself said that it was such a fundamental constitutional reform that it had to be put to the people to vote upon. And I wonder, I think Cynthia may have said this in a paper, that she felt, looking at the record elsewhere in the region, she didn't trust the Barbadians, that if she put it to them in a referendum, they would support the transition to a republic. So I'm wondering if that actually is quite an anti-Republican move and actually displays a lack of trust in the people making the decision, as opposed to the political elites.
Yes, Pearson, you have your hand up?
Yes. I want to address that issue of trust. The role of technologies in our society pretty much have created a lot of cynicism, and rightfully so. I'm going to address trust as a normative issue, shaping the environment of democratic accountability and transparency, etc. We recently had a leak or hack of a major institution in Barbados, and a range of personal data has gone into the dark web, a place no one really wants to go to. We've had several leaks of major institutions within Barbados where personal information was leaked. These kinds of disruptions, for example, they lead to reputational damage, and they lead to the breakdown of trust within the institutions that are appointed to govern us. And that is why we must be very mindful that in constructing or repurposing our institutions to serve the people, they function as they should. Now, the amount, for example, our voters list went viral. The Barbados Revenue Authority was hacked. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital, for example, was hacked, and several other government agencies. So you were there asking the question, so what? In an age of artificial intelligence, for example, where persons are repurposing information to influence voters, to influence society, to influence in society, for example, and how to think about issues, that is an assault on the integrity of any democracy. Currently, for example, why we have to be able to think about this technology and issues of trust, we have now employed social media influencers, political strategists, political consultants, for example, all, for example, to be used, quote unquote, in the democratic process. For what reason? What is the intent behind it? We have now to look at our media, where to a large extent, in some cases, we can't go back to old editions of the newspapers because they've been denied. We're seeing the use of chatbots, which are robots, for example, geared towards disseminating information within in the public to shape or to shape public opinion, to give the illusion of popularity, that the policies are being adopted by government, for example, are correct. And therefore, for those who want to massage their egos that everything is correct, they're then making decisions based on the collation of this kind of information online, that what they're doing is correct, and therefore proclaiming policy by fiat and acting by fiat. This is not the way how a democracy should be administered. Professor Giles spoke to the kind of political model necessary, for example. I raised the issue about regional constitutionalism. Since we missed the moment with the Federation, isn't it possible to think of Caribbean governance as a model for the region? Since I can recall being in CARICOM, and we spent a lot of time crafting that Caribbean Charter of Civil Society. How can that be incorporated within our national constitutions? Should we be thinking about national constitutions at all? If we're moving from the monarch to the republic, is it still necessary of national constitutions? And if technologies are undermining sovereignty, should we not be working more in concert as a region? That's dealt with in the paper. But trust is being eroded every day in our democracies with how things are being done. In the traditional forms of the media, print, radio, and now with social media. The debates are going on in social media. Should we have a conversation about social media? Not necessarily. We know what is to be done, how to think about it. Do we want to?
Thank you, Pearson. Comment coming in here. After Vibes Cartel being released by the Privy Council, people are renewed in the view
Sorry,
that there is no justice in Jamaica. The Crown will give a fairer review. So that's a comment coming in on the chat. Anyone want to address the issue with regard to going on this issue of trust, or do you want to go into some other issues that have been raised here. I have another comment.
Hamid,
yes.
Hamid, I really want to speak to the issue of, I think both Derek and Dr. Broome has been alluding and talking about it quite frontally. And that is the issue of participatory constitutionalism.
Yes,
I think that
yes.
all of us, and certainly people who are supporters of democracy, and I'm not talking about those counterfeit Democrats that they have out there, but those of us who are genuinely concerned about democracy and people's participation, we need to focus on the extent to which when we talk about constitutional reform, it is in fact associated with participatory constitutionalism. But one of the unfortunates about getting people involved in the Constitution and certainly on constitutional change, and certainly where our constitutions are concerned, and Rico was very, very careful when he went through that, we do have our constitutions, providing for, this important hurdle that we have to overcome, and that is, of course, the referendum, where you have to have in most of the Caribbean countries, either a simple majority, and in some Caribbean countries, a two-thirds majority for us to get any important change to our constitution. When it comes to, not so important issues, you just require a slim working majority. But the problem with participatory constitutionalism in the region, as Derek has been very clear, is that we have actually failed. And I think that is why he's concerned about what potentially may happen in the context of Jamaica. When we looked at St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2009, it was very obvious that again, participatory constitutionalism failed. It failed because the referendum in 2009, and Professor Ghany were very much involved with what took place in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, failed. Perhaps it had to do with the manner in which the government actually took the proposals to the people, but the entire package of reforms failed. And so in the context of Barbados, there's a long-standing view held by this Prime Minister Mia Mottley, that we needed to terminate. This is something she has advanced personally, she has advanced it privately, she has advanced it publicly, that we needed to, terminate the relationship with the British. And there is no requirement in the Barbados Constitution for a referendum. Yes, I know that OINAFA did in fact suggest that they would put the question of a transition to a republic or republicanism to the people. There was no need for that precisely because when you look, and there was no need for Mia Mottley to go that route. Yes, people argued that it is the best thing when you talk about participatory constitutionalism. But certainly the record of the Caribbean has been very dismal, extremely dismal. It has been dismal, for instance, when you had a non-mandatory referendum in Belize. In a sense, it has been dismal when you talk about, Grenada twice in 2016 and 2018. It has been very poor when you talk about Antigua. Now, yes, in both countries, it was related to I'm talking about the latter countries, St. Vincent, Grenadines, and Grenada. It was in fact related to the whole question of the place of the Caribbean Court of Justice in the judicial system in those two countries. But the other things, and we can also go to the Bahamas, where it has also been unsuccessful. So that we have to be very mindful of the fact that when the people have in fact been, when we have gone to the people, when the governments have gone to the people to get the support for things which they require to be necessary to advance the colonial issue, to advance the decolonial issue rather, and not the colonial issue, they have met with disappointments. So in the case of Barbados, it was very evident that this was not something, and it doesn't matter that I am a supporter of participatory constitutionalism, but the question was whether or not in the context of, and this is not for Barbados, but in the context of the supermajority requirement, in the context of not just a supermajority requirement, but in the context of the hyper partisanship that we have experienced in the region, which we clearly saw in 2009 in St. Vincent, there are real questions as to what is in the best interest of the state. Should we allow what is a very important political objective to really flounder because political parties, given Westminster politics, deliberately mobilize people to reject what they would privately say to you is in the best interest of the Caribbean. So we have to look at the benefits, I think, of participatory democracy, and we have to weigh against what we believe is an absolute essential for countries which have enjoyed centuries of British colonial control.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Anyone else want to come in on this line of discourse?
Yes, I would just add, are you hearing
yes,
me?
Alison.
Yes, I would
Alison,
just
go ahead.
add that I do agree with Cynthia on that point, because at the time, Motley could take a decisive action to go towards republic status without a major fallout, without having this referendum. Also, at the time, we were going through a pandemic, and previously, the last election had a low turnout at the polls. So it was also possible that the turnout for the referendum could have also been low, as persons were not interested in exercising their vote, or because of the pandemic and risking, their health if they came out to, be in the polling lines. So not holding a referendum would have been seen as efficient and practical at the time, in terms of, Derek was noting, is this a not democratic or not, Republican sort of move, but it wasn't required, and it may have been just seen as efficient and practical at the time as well.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And what I wanted to add to it is that those countries that have become republics, particularly those that became a republic after independence, so I'll leave Dominica out of the discussion now, but I'll make a comment on Dominica. They've done so in cases of electoral landslides. So in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the PNM won all 36 seats in the general election of 1971. And that paved the way for the change in the constitution to come. In 2018, the Barbados Labour Party won all of the seats in the general election. That helped to pave the way in relation to the formal constitutional procedures. In Guyana, as Derek has mentioned, there was a very questionable referendum held in 1979 that helped pave the way for the executive presidency in 1980. And in 1970, Burnham was able to change the constitution because of that questionable 1968 general election, and he was able to form an alliance afterwards with the UF, and they were able to move forward, 66 and on to 68. So 64, sorry, to 68. So that whole run up and the issue of participatory democracy and constitutionalism is an important discussion for us to look at, because in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I'm very familiar with it, in 2009, the government was able to accomplish all of the various parliamentary and constitutional stages, but the final one that required the referendum, they were not able to succeed at that point. Now, if we look at those countries that have referenda, there are some that have very steep hurdles to jump. I mean, St. Kitts Nevis, a 2/3 majority in St. Kitts and a 2/3 majority in Nevis. So you have very, very steep hurdles to jump. And now in Jamaica, as Derek was pointing out, the issue of this standoff between the JLP and the PNP on the question of whether or not the CCJ should be included in a bill to amend the Constitution, and the government not prepared to go that route just yet. And of course, Prime Minister Holness did go on breakfast television back in May of this year to indicate the reasons why Jamaica was not going to go the route of embracing the CCJ at this time. So you have a fair amount of division at the level of political elites, but then also on the ground, you have issues to contend with. And I was very, I'm grateful to Cynthia for raising the issue of Grenada in 2016 and 2018, where it actually made it to a referendum. There were 7 items on the ballot in 2016 and then 1 item on the ballot in 2018. And Antigua and Barbuda held their referendum on the same day as Grenada in 2018 with the same issue on the ballot. And the electorate, there was very low turnout, about 30% or so. And of those who bothered to turn out, a majority of that minority voted no. So that it does raise an issue. And I think this is a very important point to look at, the question of participatory democracy in relation to these kinds of constitutional reforms that you want to accomplish, and the low level of engagement. And when we look at what has happened with those countries that have gone on to become republics, the situation with regard to the huge sweep of electoral victories in the case of Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, and then of course the questionable one in Guyana. And then I come to make the comment on Dominica. It was as a result of the highly contentious independence movement process, whereby the opposition, led by Eugenia Charles, was the one who proposed republicanism. And in the context of negotiating a settlement and all of the parties, there was a special envoy sent out from the colonial office, the Commonwealth office, to go and meet the parties in Dominica, and a special report was prepared afterwards. So it was a very difficult situation in Dominica. It was not immediate political consensus on the issue, but they arrived at republicanism that would come into force in time for the termination of association in November of 1978. So I think that this issue of participatory democracy is a very important one, and I'm grateful to Cynthia for articulating it further in our discussions here. Yeah, Pearson, you have your hand up. You want to say something here? Go ahead.
Yes, I agree with this idea of participatory democracy. I do. Well, to some extent. But let's be realistic here. I'm going to bring the elephant in the room, Dr. Carter. Was Barbados really ready for a republic? We went to republic, nobody never told me anything. That's one. We went to a republic during COVID. It was a low-hanging fruit. It was a low-hanging fruit. And therefore, we had a situation where pretty much we woke up and we were told we were moving towards a republic. No major discussion, unless I didn't hear it, unless I was probably mute. I didn't hear any of that. We just moved to this republic, incomplete. And then there was a whole barrage of conflict behind. Do we have the constitution to serve the republic, etc.? It was almost an incomplete decision by fiat. So when we start to talk about things like leadership and foresight and vision, etc., seriously? Nothing was happening in Barbados during COVID, and something had to be done to appear as if something was happening. The republic was there for the taking. It happened. And there was still favor on the ground from the people because it was still a government new in its governance structure, in its governing life. So there was not much opposition to mount any attacks on why this rush to go a republic. So should the narrative not be rewritten to take into consideration how Caribbean leaders behave with reference to the unbridled power that they have access to at times, and put into context what actually occurred, or give another view? Rather than this linear view, it was time, it was taken, and everybody was in agreement, and it was a wonderful decision that was made. I am probably living under a rock, and I know I am not.
Professor Ghany, sorry, but I don't think that anybody here is suggesting that there was not opposition to the decision on the part of the Prime Minister to move to a republic. I don't think that is the case at all. Even up to it now that they have established a constitutional reform commission, there are still some people who are concerned about that movement which was made, especially as people, there was a big debate as whether or not Barbados. A decision was taken. And there was some. You may say that you were living on the rock. I don't know if that is the case, but I know that in Barbados, there was some minor, I would agree with you, that the attempt to engage in public education and sensitization on the issue was inadequate. I would agree with you, but to suggest there was none is doing exactly what social media does in the main, and that is engaging a lot of misinformation. And we should not peddle misinformation in spaces like this. I'm very sorry. We should not peddle misinformation in spaces like this, because I heard Ristock. I heard Arstock on many occasions engage in a discussion around constitutional reform, engage in a discussion around the Republic. And I disagreed with some of the things they were saying, and we had a public spat on the matter. So to say that nothing took place, I have a problem with that. But I think I think we need to move beyond that, quite frankly,
right.
Professor Ghany.
Okay. All right, colleagues. Well, 1 o'clock has come upon us, and that is the appointed time when we have to bring the discussion to a close. So let me just, in making some closing remarks here, thank all of the participants for coming. We obviously started off in a very muted and slow kind of way, and we built up towards the crescendo that we have reached, and we obviously have hit a very powerful part of this discussion, which I might add is going to continue on Monday morning, the 14th of October, between 6 and 6:30 a.m. on CBC television in Barbados on their morning program, Morning Barbados, between 6 and 6:30 a.m. Barbados time. So I imagine that this debate is going to continue, and it's a very healthy debate that we are having. In closing, I also just want to thank all of those who took the time to log on to listen to us, who are presenters and who were contributors to this special edition of the journal Social and Economic Studies, volume 72, numbers 1 and 2. And you can get electronic copies of the journal at www.mona.uwi.edu/SES. That's www.mona.uwi.edu/SES. I want to thank UETV for being involved with helping with this production. I also want to thank CBC Television in Barbados for putting this out on their YouTube channel live as we were on here today. And just to once again thank all of those who were involved with this production, Miss Mary Suen at Mona at Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, the editor of the Journal of Social and Economic Studies. I want to thank all of the staff at SALISES at Mona for their support in making this event come to pass. And just to remind you that we continue this discussion on Monday morning on CBC television in Barbados between 6 and 6:30 a.m. And we are going to carry on where we are leaving off here. Thank you again for viewing. Thank you everyone for logging on, and do have a good weekend ahead of you. Thanks again. Bye-bye.